coming out tonight. We're really happy to see everyone. Tonight we have a speaker in our Storm Surge speaker series. Laura Ludwig is here tonight, and she will be talking about marine debris removal in New England. Laura is the director and founder of the Marine Debris and Plastics Program at the Center for Coastal Studies. Okay, if you're not familiar with Storm Surge, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We've been in existence for 10 years, since 2013, and we address coastal issues of climate change by promoting science-based education. And we do that mostly through our speaker series and bringing people in to talk about certain subjects. If you go to our website, which is noted at the corner of the slide there, storm-surge.org, you'll be able to see recordings of our past events, and we'll have a recording of tonight's event as well. Also, just to note, we're a small group of people. You might see some of us around with the name tags on, and we're just all volunteers who work to put these events together. If you're interested in some of the topics that you hear tonight or see on our website, we definitely welcome you to join us and share your ideas for additional topics as well as helping out. So we would like to give a special thanks to the city of Newburyport. They offer this room for us to hold our events, as well as NCM Hub. They are the cable group associated somewhat with the city, and they are recording this event for us tonight and broadcasting live. Okay, we have a duck in the room. But that will be silent soon. Okay, one other thing before we really get into tonight's event is that in less than a month, we have our June event. We'll be right back here at the Senior Center with Russ Hopping. He's the lead coastal ecologist at the Trustees of Reservations, and he is working on a program to save the Great Marsh. So he will talk about that and share what's going on, and we'll be broadcasting live as well. So rather than introduce Laura, I'm going to introduce our special guest, Megan Chango. If you've noticed some of the artwork around the room tonight, Megan is the creator of this art. She is an artist and a resident of West Newbury. She contacted Storm Surge about a year ago and was talking about the lobster traps and debris that's coming up that she's finding on Plum Island. And she recently had moved to the Newburyport area. And what can we do about it? And well, Storm Surge didn't really feel like we could do anything about it, but Megan then just got spurred on and eventually connected with Laura. So Megan will introduce Laura tonight and share her experience with Laura. And just I wanted to note that Megan is also involved in Newburyport. She, for Earth Day last year, 22, she took some of the lobster pot materials that she found on Plum Island, and she had an installation at, on the downtown area. I don't know if you missed that or not, but that was a year ago. And then this year for Earth Day, she directed the program for the Windows for Change, where she worked with local youth to create art, and then that art was displayed in the storefronts. So those events have passed, but if you Google them, you'll find some details about them. And Megan's going to introduce Laura and talk about, you come up. Okay, all right, thank you. Let me advance the slide view. Okay, you're all set to go. Okay.
Thank you. Hi, does this work? I probably need to lower it. So hi. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Megan Chango, and I moved here to West Newbury almost 2 years ago with my family. And even though it's just 45 minutes away, I used to live in Burlington, Massachusetts. This is like a whole new world up here. So sorry. Okay, lower? Yeah, okay. You need special attention here.
Perfect. Thank you. If you could speak right into
Sure. Okay. So, you know, after moving here, and since I've moved here, I've been enthusiastically exploring all the green spaces here, which I'm very, very grateful for. So if for any of you here who has been a part of preserving those spaces, I want to say thank you.
You gotta speak right into the mic.
Right. So it's a gratitude for these spaces that instills a desire in myself to also do my part and to support these habitats. And as many of you know, the process of moving from your home from one place to another is a lot of work. And it also opens your eyes as to how much stuff we accumulate as human beings in our day-to-day. And even when we try to stay conscious of it all, religiously composting and avoiding single-use products, it's impossible to not be part of the problem when it comes to a surplus of waste. Especially here in the US, which as a country is the largest contributor to plastic in the world. 2 years ago, I was rattled to learn that in our country, roughly 287 pounds of plastic is generated each year per person. The availability of single-use plastics has permeated nearly every aspect of our day, from buying veggies at the grocery stores and plastic foam sheets, and to my kids' obsessions with nearly useless plastic knickknacks. And while exploring the shores here, as you likely have experienced as well, I encountered a surprising amount of washed up lobster traps and other fishing gear that was also made of plastic. And even though I could not personally avoid contributing to the production of 287 pounds of plastic, here, right in front of me, was the opportunity to remove 287 pounds of plastic. And even better, it looked like there was enough material to remove 1,148 pounds of plastic, which would offset not just mine, but my whole family's negative contributions. So cleaning it up seemed like a no-brainer. But to my chagrin, I also came upon numerous signs that were stated, "Do not remove the fishing debris." And that by doing so, I could be fined for up to $180. And this made no sense to me whatsoever. So I set about finding answers. And in my research, I discovered the work of Laura Ludwig, who runs the plastics program at the Center for Coastal Studies on the Cape. And not only did she return my calls and generously offer her time and expertise, she assured me that my frustrations were valid. Learning more about Laura's approach gave me a sense of hope and relief. Here were systems that finally made sense to me. Her programming not only successfully addresses the plastics issue, but it also benefits all parties involved and simultaneously forms new community connections. There is so much to learn from this. Over the past year, I'm grateful to have been able to get to know Laura more and to be able to experience her work firsthand. And I'll let her tell you all about it. So I'm beyond honored to introduce Laura Ludwig here tonight and have her share her approach with you. And I hope hearing about her programming can bring you hope like it has to me.
I'm wearing my heels, so I'll put this up a little higher here. I'm honored to be here. Thank you all. That is a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that, Megan. And I appreciate all of you coming out tonight. This is I've been looking forward to this for about 8 months. I think we've been talking about it, and we're going to have a little fun here tonight. And hopefully, it will give you a little more insight to the references that Megan was making. I'm wondering about the lights and whether there's any way to dim them a tiny bit just for the benefit of the slides, but if it makes it more difficult for people to see, we can also leave them up. That's great. That helps a lot. Thank you, I think, if that's okay with everyone. So yes, this presentation this evening is about collaboration and community, and that's brought me from Provincetown all the way to the other Cape. Well, I guess you're not technically Cape Ann, but you're pretty close. I wanted to start just by with a little bit of data, because data is a really important component of the work that I do. You probably all know this. You're part of the storm surge groupies, and I love that. But I don't know if you have dug down quite as deep into it, and I know you saw the movie Story of Plastics recently, perhaps, so you've probably heard some of these statistics. They're sobering, if not depressing, downright. So the plastic production on our planet stands to go even higher in the next 25 years as the petroleum companies ramp up their so-called recycling efforts and plastic production using virgin and so-called recycled plastics. So these numbers are probably conservative, and it's hard to conceive of the millions that are involved, but those are the current numbers. And if you think about it, anything that's made of plastic, the only way you can get rid of it is if you burn it. If you bury it, it doesn't decompose. If it's left to its natural devices, it just remains in the environment. If it goes into the ocean, it may float or it may sink, but it will still be there. So every single piece of plastic that has ever been made on the planet still exists, unless it was burned, and then it's just poisoned the air. There's really hard to get these numbers exact. Nobody has an actual exact number of how much plastic is actually in the ocean at this time. There's been a lot of effort to try to document it, to try to extrapolate based on inputs, and the estimates are as high as 300 billion tons of plastic in the ocean already. And if you look at the first statistic of the increase of production over the past 50 years, you can see that that actually correlates. And the number, plastic is not that heavy typically, so the number of pieces is actually quite remarkable. Over 170 trillion pieces, it's been estimated, is either floating or sunk to the bottom of the ocean in that period of time of production. There's a little meme that shows a dump truck dumping plastic into the ocean every second. That's how many dump trucks it would take to get 8 million tons of plastic added annually, and that's the estimate. There was a rigorous examination of the inputs based on what plastics had been recycled, what had been shown up in the municipal solid waste stream, and everything else was assumed to have been lost to the environment. And then there was an extrapolation to determine how much of that might have landed in the ocean. And that's where that 8 million tons figure comes from, and I think that paper was out in 2020. So it's a very sobering amount of plastic, even with our awareness, that is still entering the marine environment. And many places have banned single-use water bottles. Even so, the global use of single-use water bottles, those little thin plastic bottles made of polyethylene, are sold in the millions every minute around the planet, sold or given away or distributed or used. And, you know, we consumers do what we can to reduce these things, but there's a bigger system out there that's hard to combat. You've all seen the photos of the albatrosses with their stomachs exposed because the babies are being fed plastic that the parents bring back to them because the plastics float and they're bright and pretty and they are fun to pick up and they can easily scoop them and they don't put up a fight when you try to catch them if you're an albatross. But then when you feed them to your babies, they feel like they're eating something, but they die of starvation. This has been happening not only with the albatross species, but with other pelagic birds that feed on the ocean. And the estimates are that shortly they will all exhibit microplastics or macroplastics in their systems. And that is another whole presentation in and of itself. Not only is it just the physical parts of plastic that we're concerned about, but it's the actual toxins that adsorb to those plastics when they're in the ocean, because the ocean is a sink. There are lots of chemicals in our ocean, and the microparticles are perfect surfaces for those toxins to attach to. And so what you wind up with is little plastic toxic pellets that are ingested by any number of creatures, and that includes birds, fish, mammals. And these are toxins and chemicals that have multisyllable words, names, that something like PCBs and the like, and that is been demonstrated to be exponentially greater the smaller the piece. So it's an interesting correlation that the smaller the plastic, the more the toxins absorb to it. And I mean, you can just say basically everything on the planet is affected by this at some level, whether it's ingested, entangled by it, or breathed into the lungs, and that we are among those that are affected by it. And I'm sure you have heard through the story of plastic, as well as just turning on the news, that plastics have been found in human lungs, human blood, and human I'm sure there's another piece that I'm missing of us. Where else? Yeah, exactly. We're basically, I think we ingest a credit card's worth of plastics every year. But the impacts of that are not really well established, and that's a lot of more research is required to know what the impacts to our species may be as a result of ingesting and breathing in plastics. But that's all beyond the scope of my pay grade, but guess what fishing gear is made of? And Megan referred to this earlier. These are the plastics I deal with. This is rope. Rope is made of polypropylene, polyethylene, polysteel, which is basically a combination of 2 or 3 different types of polymers. Its nets and rope are made of polyester, which is also a form of nylon. You've heard of these fabric-type plastics. And lobster traps are all coated nowadays with polyvinyl chloride. So these are my plastics, and the impacts to human health are also unknown, but there are a lot of other impacts that are pretty well documented. So how does somebody get to the point where they study plastic or work with plastic fishing gear or even have anything to talk about with respect to plastics in the ocean? I don't know how others do it, but I started very honestly by helping my dad untangle rope on the shores of islands in Maine when I was about 10 or 5 or 8 or something. My father is a consummate rope untangler. And he was in the Navy, and that was sort of his thing. He would do anything he could to conserve rope, because you never know when you might need it. And I found these photos as I was going through my family photo album recently, because you never know what treasures you find. And I do remember this day, actually. It was off of Friendship, Maine. And as I say, this nut did not fall from that tree. This is me on a fun walk, not a beach cleanup, but I found a shop vac, and I thought, oh, I gotta bring this home. And so this was just in Provincetown a few years back, but it runs in our family, shall we say. But then how do you turn that sort of attention into a job? Well, this is gonna be a little bit of indulgence, just bear with me. I wanted to go through how I got to the point where I basically collaborate with anyone who wants to. The first job that I had that is even ocean-oriented was in Quebec, and I studied blue whales. Why? Well, because they were there, and I happened to go up there with someone who needed help, and so I became the field assistant, and I studied blue whales at the Mending Island Cetacean Study in Long Point de Menga, which is on the north shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And it doesn't even show up on the left map, so I put a little inset map there where the star is. And that is a blue whale. It's the largest creature to ever be on the planet, including dinosaurs, and I got really close to them. That was a lot of fun, and it also put me in the way of thinking of the ocean, because I was from Vermont. They don't have an ocean in Vermont. And then from there, I started lobstering with my cousin, Carrie. And why did I do that? Well, because her stern man had an accident and she needed help, and I didn't have a job. So I worked with my cousin, Carrie. She's a commercial lobsterman in Popham Beach. And then after that job was over, I built a bridge in Bath. And so that got me in touch with a lot of fishermen, because a lot of fishermen in the off-season work on bridges. And what do you know? So I learned a lot about the industry, the lobster industry, from this time period. which comes into play a little bit later because then the lobster industry in Maine really was coming under fire for entangling whales. And so there was a lot of discussion about how to prevent that, and the state of Maine created a job, and I got the job because I had whale experience and I had lobstering experience. Who else had that? Nobody. So I was a shoo-in. So while I worked at the Maine Department of Marine Resources, I worked with fishermen to learn how to train them on how to disentangle whales, which I myself received training in. And I also worked with fishermen on how to identify the issues with the rope and then solve those issues. Did I mention I was a music major? No, well, so there you go. After that, there was a job at the Gulf of Maine Lobster Foundation in Kennebunk, Maine, which is just up the road from you folks. And we did a buyback program of rope. And then from there, of course, I moved to Provincetown. And I married my husband, and he was a 12th generation Provincetowner, and he was not about to leave and move to Maine. So now I'm on the Cape Cod, and I took my job with me. And I'm going to talk about these jobs a little bit, because they're all related to the whale rope nexus, I call it. Whales get entangled in rope. That's A plus B equals C. It doesn't happen every time, and it doesn't happen everywhere, but it does happen, and most right whales, which that's a cartoon version of, 85% of them show scars that they've been entangled, and if you've been paying attention at all to the lobster fishery, then you know that right whales have been entangled in a lot of lobster gear, some of it from Canada and some of it from the US. All of the work that I just described relates to that somehow, and I got very familiar with the entanglement issue, but I also got very familiar with the gear that creates the problem, and I began to try to solve that. When the Maine lobster fishery was, when the entire lobster fishery was mandated to switch their rope out, maybe some of you remember this, all of the rope they used, they loved it. It was so cheap and colorful, and they could put their 50 fathom warps were yellow, and their 100 fathom warps were green, and they could just tell what the lengths were by the colors, and they'd whip them on there. And maybe some of you are lobstermen, so you know what I'm talking about. It was a lot easier to use polypropylene on your ground lines than anything else. But they were implicated in entangling whales, and the powers that be, which included fishermen ultimately, determined that that needed to change, and the determination was that they needed to swap out all of the rope they used that was floating and replace it with heavier rope that would sink to the bottom, which, if you look at this slide, is the rope between the two traps on the bottom. I'm sure you guys know enough about lobstering to understand, you know, the premise of the buoy at the surface. The line that leads to the first trap is the buoy line or the end line, and then the rope between the traps is the ground line or the bottom line. So I started the Bottom Line Project, and this was a buyback program that was funded by the federal government, and I worked very closely with someone in this very room, and I'm so grateful that she attended tonight because she is part of the Protected Resources Division in Gloucester at the National Marine Fisheries Service, and thank you so much, or it's GARFO now, I guess, which is the Greater Atlantic something Fisheries Organization. What's the R? Regional Fisheries, yes. So thank you, Diane, for being here. And this was a very contentious time in the Maine fishery where millions, literally over 2 million pounds of very lightweight float rope, which equates to hundreds of miles of rope, had to come out of the fishery. What were we going to do with all of this? What do you do with 2 million pounds of float rope? Well, that got me really familiar with people who like to use float rope to make doormats, and maybe some of you have these on your doorsteps, but this all came out of my program in Maine when we were deciding what to do with 2 million pounds. I was bound and determined not to put it in a landfill, so we wound up just doing a lot of R&D, and finally the rope people were like, well, we used to make rope doormats out of this stuff. You got any we could have? And I'm like, here's 1 million pounds, go for it. So they were very happy, and that still goes on today. In fact, ironically, they've run out of float rope, so now they have to buy new float rope to make doormats, which is like, bang. Anyway, so there are many people in Maine that have made quite a good living using the colorful lobster line to create products. So the problem is, once you switch out the ground line to something that sinks and hits the bottom, guess what happens? It comes up against rocks, it comes up under rocks, it comes up into little crevices, it gets caught, the sand gets in it, you haul it through your hauler. It basically created a whole new problem of gear loss. The floating rope avoided all of those sharp rocks. The sinking rope sinks to the bottom. And in Maine, there's a lot of rocks on the bottom. Not so much in Cape Cod Bay where I am now. It's a different issue though. If you have a piece of fabric and you roll around in the sand with it, it doesn't feel good when you put it on your skin, right? It's embedded, the sand is, stuck in there, and that's what happens with the rope fibers. The sand gets in there and it runs through the hauler and it weakens those fibers like sandpaper would if it were rubbing on your sweater, and then the rope is weakened and the lobster traps are lost as a result of the different rope. So that's one very significant cause of gear loss. And so a lot of fishermen don't want to lose their traps, and therefore they take off their old sink rope and they don't know what to do with it. They take it off to put the new stuff on, but then what do? You've got all this old rope that looks perfectly fine, but you might lose your traps if you continue to fish it. So it created this very immense issue of a waste stream no one had to deal with. So luckily, hang on just a second. Sorry about that. Luckily, there was a woman named Orly Genger, and she used to make sculptures out of climbing rope, but it was too expensive. So she heard about my program, and guess what? She paid me to find fishermen who had rope to get rid of, and we did. We found over 320,000 pounds of rope for her. This is how I would collect it. This is all used lobster rope that had to be removed from their operation in order to not lose lobster traps. And then she, this wonderful artist, would take this rope that you would see in the warehouses where we would collect it and store it for her, and then I would truck it down to her in Brooklyn, and she would sit there with, it was like a quilting bee with rope, with all of these people. They would sit on the floor and crochet these huge, long runners, and that were big rolls of runners there, and then they would paint them with house paint, and then they would stack the runners up on top of each other using step ladders, and they would just use this rope to create these sculptures. And these are all made from lobster rope that was retired from the fishery. But there was only one Orly Genger, and she had a baby and stopped doing it. So now what am I gonna do with all of this rope? So as a result of the rope and other reasons creating lost lobster gear, it created another job for me, which was getting the lost lobster gear off the bottom of the ocean. And that was first done, I think, in the Northwest in, what am I trying to say? It's Puget Sound. And they were the first people in the country to be doing a directed effort to remove fishing gear. Their fishing gear was salmon nets. But I knew they were doing that project, and I knew that people were recovering trash that was fishing gear from the ocean. So I thought, well, let's do that with all our lobster traps. Has anyone ever done that before? Well, I don't think so, but let's try it. So we got some money from the federal government, and we basically started getting lost lobster gear out of the ocean. Over the time that I've been doing this, this is basically the process that we use. And I'm not going to read it out loud to you. You can read it for yourself. But this is a typical sort of recovered lobster trap that we would get. It's covered with lots of biota, and it has perhaps living creatures in it that we release, and it also may have identifying tags on it. So over the years, I've done several of these efforts, and starting in 2010, that was the first one, so that was 13 years ago, my God. No, yeah, is that right? Yeah, that's right. And we're still doing it today. So these are just different areas, and I took the work with me when I moved to marry my husband. So nobody in Maine is really doing that right now. They do some things like that, but not quite, and I'm the only one we are the only one doing it in Massachusetts. So these are some of the statistics, and I added in the 2023 results. Finally, I got the weights from the guys that I use as a vendor. So you can see I've gotten 160,000 pounds of stuff. This is just out of Cape Cod Bay. This doesn't even include Maine. And you can see it was, you know, their number of traps there was 1,772. Now, I can only work in 1 month of the year, basically, with the month of April. I can only work in certain areas because I don't have a very big budget, and I can't just do the whole entire Cape Cod Bay. And I can only work, out of a couple of different harbors. So that limits, you know, if you don't have a huge budget and an infinite amount of time, money, and resources, you can't do much more than what you're allowed. And so this has been constrained by basically safe operations and funding. I have no doubt I could go out every single day and bring lobster traps in, no matter what day of the week it was. There's no question in my mind. But we focus on hotspots, and we focus on areas that we are, over time, have become familiar locations. I want to take a little break right now, just to get your brains in a different space, and everybody move your legs around, don't fall asleep on me, we've got a long way to go. But think about this. Why is all this stuff on the bottom of the ocean? I did describe one reason, but there's probably others. What do you think might create lobster gear, groundfish gear, aquaculture gear? Why does it wind up in the ocean and then sometimes up on shore? Why? And then what options do we have for preventing that? What could we do so that didn't happen? You know, I've been asking myself that for a long time. And then even if we are able to successfully get it out of the ocean, what do we do with it when we get it back to shore? It's got to go somewhere. And half the reason it's there in the first place is because they didn't know what to do with it when they got it, or when it was, you know, when they interacted with it, or maybe when it was at the end of its life. And then what are some possible outcomes for gear that is maybe not lost at sea, but like the photo I showed you with the big totes full of rope? That's the end-of-life fishing gear, EOLFG we call it, just because after you say end-of-life fishing gear 100 times, it becomes a little, but EOLF doesn't sound right anyway. It's becoming more understood that it's hard to get rid of this stuff. This is one net from a midwater trawler. Midwater trawlers catch your herring, they catch your flounders and any fish that kind of come up into the water column. If you eat fish and it's and you live on the planet Earth, lots of it's caught in this kind of equipment. What does a fisherman or a fishing company do when it's done, when the net is no longer serving its purpose, when it has holes in it, when it's older, when it's dried out, or however it deteriorates? That's one net. It weighs 8,000 pounds. Well, this is Pamela Moulton. Pamela is an artist who's dying to get her hands on 8,000 pounds of the right kind of net because she creates remarkable sculptures from it. So we found each other, as we do, as one does with the world of technology, and I've been working with her along with a couple other colleagues that deal with fishing gear to provide her with the nets that she needs to make her installations. That was in Portland, Maine for a year. I don't know where she moved it to, but she made several of these, and they each weigh 1,000 pounds, those sculptures there. It's about 10 feet tall. And she makes other things as well. Here's another artist that loves net, and her name is Jen, and she lives in Harwich, near on the Cape. And this is a net that the guy didn't know what to do with, and I said, I can help you with that. So what does she do with it? She undoes it, dyes it, and then creates things. She calls it humane taxidermy, and she sells them for lots of money. They're really beautiful. This is just two examples of them. This is a wall hanging, and that's a standalone sculpture. And it takes a lot of time for her to do all of that, but that's her medium of choice at this time until her fingers give out. And then there's an artist who had never done anything like this before, but knew she needed some fishing gear to do this thing that she was going to do, and I'll describe it to you. But this net came up off the bottom of the ocean during my ghost gear retrieval project. I took it in my truck, and then she came over with her trailer, took some traps and that net, took it home, and then installed this at Martha's Vineyard. This is an installation that involves light, sound, the sound of humpback whales, recorded in Hawaii. She is a sound technician, and they are played off of the net. And she has installed this in 4 different places, including Brooklyn and Mass MoCA. And so these are creative ways of using the stuff. And people talk about, oh, wow, I heard you got this program. How's it going? And I'm like, yeah, it's going pretty good. We got artists using fishing gear, and you're getting stuff. And one time, one of the Marine Patrol guys asked me, he said, do you ever do any work on Cutty Hunk with this stuff? And I said, Cutty Hunk? Where's Cutty Hunk? And they told me where it was. Who knows where Cutty Hunk is? Okay, whoa, that's great. Not everybody, though, right? It's an island. It's very far south in the Buzzards Bay area. It's down between Block Island and Martha's Vineyard, kind of. Well, I said, what's up with Cutty Hunk? Why would I want to go to Cutty Hunk? He's like, oh, they got some lobster traps on their shoreline, and they don't know what to do with it all. So the picture here is generated by my colleague at the Center for Coastal Studies, who is our aerial technician, and he flew a drone around the shoreline. We went out in March, and then he went through the imagery and identified where the lobster traps were, and all those little yellow dots are likely locations. So you remember this woman right here, Annie? Annie is a Cornell professor of composition and music performance, and she has a class that she created by collaborating with me on how to create the class to take her students out of Cornell for a week on spring break, embed them in my program, and have them learn a little bit about the issue. Well, that was going to happen in Provincetown this year, but then I heard about Cutty Hunk, so guess who went to Cutty Hunk? So this is Cutty Hunk Island, and as you can see, there's a lot of cliffs on the left that gives you a little indication of how tricky it is to remove anything from Cutty Hunk Island. It's challenging to get to. It's steep cliffs. It's rocky. It's hard to walk on that stuff. And it takes a lot of people to collect the stuff that's on a shoreline. I haven't talked to you at all about my beach cleanup program. That's a whole different ball of wax. And yet it is a huge piece of this because fishing gear washes up on shorelines around New England, and yet so does everything else. We found more Gatorade bottles than you can shake a stick at. I have no idea why Gatorade, but maybe it's because they had single-use water bottle bans in place and everybody switched to Gatorade or something, but everything, there are a few water bottles, but there were a lot of Gatorade bottles. And you've been in the room maybe only a short time, but afterward, please walk around and take a look at a couple of the pieces of artwork hanging on the walls, which reflect some of the things that we not only found on Cutty Hunk, but counted. We counted everything. And we got over, 5,200 and something pieces of trash, not including lobster traps. The traps and the gear, we finally got the weights for it. It was approximately 13,000 pounds of what am I trying to say? It was it was about 15,700 pounds of trash that we removed from the shoreline of Cutty Hunk, and this was last month. And this is just one little tiny pile of rope that we took off the island with us. But the thing about it is that there's no way I could have done this without Annie's class from Cornell. They were perfect for this. There were students from age 19 to 21, and they came out, and we had a great time. I had 5 artists on the island with me. I had Marine Patrol working with me. I had all these amazing people because this requires a lot of people. And so this was a fun picture that we took that, you can see who's there. And that's just part of it. One of the other people who was there was Megan, and she worked harder than anyone to remove the stuff off of the shoreline, and she was so happy because we gave her permission to remove fishing gear from the shore. And she was like, this is what it should be like. The reality is you have to have authority to do it. Not so much the rope because it's hard to identify that, but there are laws on the books that prevent anyone from removing a lobster trap, and that's infuriating, and it's also changing. In Massachusetts, I'm on a task force that's convened by the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries to look at the problem that prevents people from removing fishing gear and also prevents fishermen from bringing it in when they find it. by relieving those two constraints, we may be able to make a much bigger dent in how we handle fishing gear when we find it, at least in Massachusetts. Maine is a whole different ball of wax. I wanted to just point out that when you look at the artwork around the room, the one image you won't see is the gloves because it's at a juried exhibit, right? And so she was planning to bring it tonight. But the lobster trap pile is here somewhere, right here. And then I also have, this photo here is represented over here. Megan did just an amazing job capturing the essence of Cutty Hunk on your drawings here. So I hope you do take a chance while you're here to examine her. Are they drawings? They're paintings? They're
I got to add a high schooler who was hauling all of the debris. You have to.
So instead of photoshopping, she took the liberty, artistic license, of adding the three people who weren't in the photo who were essential for our effort. One of them was a high schooler who drove the ATV miles and miles and miles, hauling traps back and forth for us. And then also the photographer who was and also an artist, and then also the oysterman that started this whole thing by complaining a lot. And it was a wonderful group, but this is I love this photo because this is the end of the week and we're tired, but we're happy. So this talk has kind of been about collaboration, and I've mentioned some of these outfits on the left already. But if you think about it, AmeriCorps, Blue Ocean Society in Portsmouth, Cape Cod National Seashore, I work with them all the time. Care for the Cape and Islands is based in Yarmouth. Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation is in Rhode Island. Commercial and recreational fishermen up and down the East Coast. Cornell University is in New York. Cutty Hunk Shellfish Farms on the island. Fine Arts Work Center is an arts center in Provincetown. Gulf of Maine Association is the Gulf of Maine Association. Gulf of Maine Lobster Foundation is based in Kennebunk. The Mass Division of Marine Fisheries, Mass Environmental Police. Nova Scotia Beach Garbage Awareness has been collecting lobster trap tags for about 10 years, and she documents them all for me, and we have a database this bigger than this room. Provincetown Department of Public Works helps with heavy equipment every time I need to load a dumpster. Surfrider Foundation is collecting data for me about lobster traps and tags. Urban Harbors Institute in Boston is helping with the data collection. We couldn't do this by ourselves. We are funded federally, we are funded regionally through the Restore America's Estuaries was the Cutty Hunk funders. It's really hard to do this work, and it's super expensive, and, well, we're actually pretty efficient at it, to be honest, and it takes a lot of people to do it all. And the cool thing is, it's going to keep going, because in October, there was a great big opportunity for a lot of money to be invested in the effort to reduce or prevent large-scale marine debris, and I applied for it. The minimum amount of money that you could ask for was $1 million. The most money I've ever gotten from a grant was $300,000. So I put together a proposal working with these very fine collaborators, and we were awarded, recommended for funding, I should say, $2.8 million. And that is why you're going to see a lot more of me, because this is how collaboration continues. And we're coming here, and we'll be working with Megan to make sure that your coastlines can get the fishing gear off of them. That's it. And now I have to go back and plant some dahlias. So that's it for me. Now, thank you very much. I'm sure I went over time. However, if there is time for questioning, I would be happy to take some questions, and I will repeat the questions into the microphone if anyone has one. Yes, ma'am?
I'm not sure if you already said it, and I just didn't get it. How do you figure out where the rope and the discarded lobster traps are? Do you use water?
Yeah, I kind of glossed over that. There's a lot of methods to be used. One of them is a needle in a haystack kind of effort. But primarily we use side scan sonar. We have very sophisticated equipment at the Center for Coastal Studies. We get anecdotal, the question was, and I forgot to repeat it. Sorry, Maria, where are you? So I'm sorry, the question was, how do we find the rope and traps in order to recover them? Yeah, because out of sight, out of mind, right? You look at the ocean, it looks great. So we use side scan sonar. It would be futile futile to take a side scan sonar equipment that's super expensive and just try to side scan sonar everywhere you've randomly wanted to go. So we've done two different things. We've used anecdotal input from fishermen who know absolutely where the gear balls are and absolutely where they themselves have lost gear. So that requires outreach, it requires communication, it requires attending meetings and going to association, trade shows, et cetera. And then the other thing that we do is go to places where we have gotten it before, because it's a reaccumulation issue. In the Cape Cod Bay area where I work, it's an established mechanism for a ground fish boat who has encountered lost fishing gear in his harvesting to not dump it back into the ocean, but to dump it in a certain spot so that it doesn't interfere with future harvesting efforts. That's called dumping on the numbers, and it is an established practice because there's no port infrastructures for them to come back to and say, oh, I found 80 traps in my haul, and nor do they have room on their deck to bring this stuff back. So it can be very dangerous to encounter lost fishing gear in the course of harvesting, particularly for a dragger. And so they don't want it in the way. It can cause lots of accidents, and it's a very frustrating thing. So we kind of know where those areas are. It's very frustrating for me to think, this is a terrible reason to have a job, that I get to go out and go pick up someone else's trash. But if I don't do it, it's just going to stay there, and it's going to accumulate and become a larger and larger pile. So by doing this over the years, and those numbers that you saw in one of my slides, which is basically, tallying the annual collection, we are able to see that there's actually a little bit less each year. And that's kind of heartening because we're getting somewhere, but it also allows us to go in other locations so that we can experiment and try to find other hotspots. The funding I just talked about is going to allow me to go to other areas of Massachusetts, which are notorious, like off of New Bedford and off of Gloucester, quite frankly. So we are looking forward to running our side scan off of Cape Ann, and I'll be working with commercial fishermen in that area to do that. Also, Boston Harbor is another notorious area. So these are areas that we've got input from the industry that we will then send our side scan out there. We can only do it in certain times of the year, and it can only be done when there's no interference, like boat traffic or fishing or bad weather. So we're really limited as to when that is effective, but that is our primary mechanism. And I'm sorry for the long answer, but that's why I didn't talk about it, because it's kind of complicated. But thank you for the question, yeah. Does anyone else have a question? Yes, sir.
What is the rationale for the laws prohibiting removal of the old gear?
The question is, what's the rationale for the laws that prohibit the removal of ghost gear or lost gear? So back when they were promulgated in the 70s or 60s or 40s or whenever they were, lobster gear was made of wood, and people used to love to find old lobster traps and bring them home and make coffee tables out of them. And so laws were put on the books so that you couldn't do that. And unfortunately, they didn't keep up with the times. And I'm not kidding. That was established in, I don't remember the year. Diane, do you have any sense of when that was? Yeah, no. I mean, it's like maybe in the 1800s they established that law. So it's very archaic. And the task force has been really useful because these data, and others like these, like from other parts of my program, have fed into the state's consideration of the issue, and they are taking it seriously. The director of the Division of Marine Fisheries has been getting my data for 10 years, and he is kind of like, we need to kind of do something about this. What can we do? So this is just the at-sea removals. On the shoreline, I don't even have that slide in here, we've removed thousands of lobster traps now, including cutty hunk, from the shoreline with state authorization. But I can't respond to every phone call and say, sure, I'm gonna come get the trap because I have authority. So we need to be able to allow people to do it, make sure that we're not molesting fishing gear when we do it, or make sure we can get it back to the owner when it's possible. So what we've done is made definitions of what constitutes an active fishing trap or an inactive fishing trap. And so with those definitions, once they've been codified, that will allow anyone to take a lobster trap off the beach. But then what they do with it, that's the next problem, and making sure transfer stations and whatever can handle that. Yes, sir?
Regarding right whales, what do you think of NOAA's recommendation to have lobster traps that don't have vertical ropes, but might go through high-tech elements that could, you know, that you could catch lobsters but not have the line in the water?
Thank you for the question. I'm sure you all heard that. Do I need to repeat that one, do you think, Maria, as well?
Yes, if you
Okay.
could, for the TV.
Sure. So the question is regarding the investigation of what we're calling on-demand lobster gear, and what are the sort of implications, or what's my opinion about it, I guess was your question. But so on-demand lobster gear is being tested as we speak, and it has been being tested for many years. And it is a viable fishing mechanism in many parts of the world. I don't know if many, in a few parts of the world. They use it very successfully in around Australia and New Zealand to catch lobsters in that area. And the reason that they have been very successful there is because, let me describe what it is. Do you all know what on-demand fishing gear is? Ropeless fishing. So it would be, for example, a lobster trap that was set on the bottom of the ocean without a buoy. So that, in other words, the traps that you see here would be just like that, but there would be no vertical line, no end line. And therefore, the chances of entangling a whale would be reduced dramatically. And then when a fisherman would want to retrieve that lobster trap at the bottom, he would have a gadget on his boat, he or she would have a gadget on their boat, and they'd push a button, and it would release something in the trap that would come to the surface. In fact, it could release the trap itself, which might float up. There's a float bag being tested. And then they would retrieve that thing that comes to the surface as they have asked for it to come up. And that works in some areas where there are very few people fishing, where there's a great area to work in. In other words, there's lots of space to spread out. And when there's not a lot of other competing interests, whether it's mobile fishing gear or other lobstermen who may accidentally set their gear on top of yours. So the jury is out as to whether it will work in the New England lobster fishery, in my opinion. I think it will work very well offshore, where people are fishing lobster traps in strings of 50 sometimes, 50 traps altogether, and this is way offshore, 26 miles or more sometimes. Or it could work in areas where there are very few people fishing, and who all know each other so that they can communicate. But the technology of being able to see someone else's fishing gear, understanding what that means when you look at it on your technological application, and then knowing how to navigate around other people, those are the field challenges, in my opinion, that will really be tough to solve unless there is a paradigm shift in the way that people go lobstering. Right now, that technology will not work the way that people fish right now. But it could if there are there other adjustments. And that would remove a lot of rope from the ocean and prevent more entanglements. I agree. It's a very tough nut to crack. So there's a lot of research happening about that right now. Probably some guys right out in your backyard. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I love this question. Can you stop making fishing gear out of plastic? So I have a proposal that's ready to go, and I can't wait to get funding. It's called Your Grandfather's Lobster Co-op. And the lobsterman's gonna get paid for fishing with wood traps, sisal, hemp, mushroom buoys or cork buoys, linen, twine, anything that's biodegradable. It's still strong, some of it can be quite strong, but if it were left at the bottom of the ocean, it wouldn't hurt anything, it wouldn't create any microplastics, and nobody would die if they swallowed it. But the problem is, it would also require you to fish slower. You couldn't go, rip your thing up and throw it on the deck. I mean, this is how lobstermen fish. Have you ever seen how lobstermen fish? I mean, the guys that have these $400,000 million boats cannot fish slowly. They have strong gear, they have lots of it, and they have to go fast, and they have to haul through really quickly, and they haul 200 to 400 traps a day, and you can't do that with wood gear. it would be a great thing for them to get paid, let's say $20 a pound for their lobsters if they didn't catch any whales and they didn't create any plastic. And I think there's a market for it. So I have a proposal that's ready to go. I just need some money for it. Megan, what's your question?
A question about how the lobster industry has changed, though, because of the declining lobster populations. How have you seen that shift happening along our coastlines?
The question has to do with how has the lobster industry changed as a result of climate change? Or have I observed anything?
Like where has the lobster been moving?
Lobster been moving, yes. So what are the shifts in the fishery that I've observed? Cutty Hunk was a unique opportunity to examine that close up. When we were on Cutty Hunk and we were removing lobster gear from the shoreline, we counted all the traps that we could and we identified them to the owner whenever we could. And so we were able to ascertain, because of the ID tags that are in the traps, we were able to ascertain the age of the lobster traps. Okay, that's weird because lobster traps are like timeless, right? But every year, the lobsterman, to fish legally, has to put a brand new tag in it that has this year in it. So if you look at the tags in a lobster trap and you do the math, you can tell how old they are. So we were finding traps with the earliest lobster tag on them. They were not issued prior to 1996. And we found tags that were from 1996, and we also found plenty of lobster traps with no tags in them that could have been even older. So what we did also find is that there were traps from last year on the island. So we've been getting traps washing up on the shoreline of Cutty Hunk, for example, for at least 25 years. Well, what we're going to do is go back and take a look at how many traps there are after next winter and just see what those reaccumulation rates might be. The shift is I bet we're not going to get very much because, and here's what more to your question. The lobster fishery is pretty much defunct in southern New England. Lobsters have migrated north. The waters are too warm in southern New England, and there are far fewer people fishing for lobsters, so there's far less gear. Of the ones who are fishing in that area still, the regulations about how they rig their gear have also changed. They're no longer allowed to fish single traps. They can only fish 3 traps at a time. That means there's 1 buoy to 3 traps, or more. You can put more. And so what that means is that they may be able to retrieve their lost gear more readily because it has the rope that ties the traps together instead of just losing 1 trap and going, I don't know where it is because the buoy's gone. So you can probably expect there to be less gear. Lobsters have definitely, as a stock, shifted more northward, as has much of the rest of the the ecosystem because of the warming waters. How that affects the industry will definitely make a difference in the landings and also where they put their gear. In Maine, it hasn't been as noticeable because people fish all the time year-round. There's no closures. But in Massachusetts, it has been noticeable because there aren't a lot of lobsters in Cape Cod Bay in the summer anymore, or there weren't last year. So they are having to go a little further. So there's definitely shifts. Fishermen know it better than anyone because they're the ones trying to make a living out there. And so we are seeing that with the gear as well and the accumulations. So I'm sure we're going to see it on Cutty Hunk. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your contribution, Laura.
You're welcome.
Is what you're doing fostering anything being done in Canada, given the Maine, Canada lobster war that's going on?
So the question has to do with whether anything like this, the gear removals, et cetera, are happening in Canada. Canada is near and dear to my heart. They also didn't have any stick to get them here. They had lots of carrots, and they are doing what they can. They don't have any real enforcement about any of their regulations. They are voluntary at this time regarding entanglement mitigation and gear loss and gear documentation. Canada, I love Canada. I lived in Quebec for many years. I feel like, there's a lot of potential there for them to be trendsetters and be leaders in this because they are putting a lot of money at the issue of whale entanglement. However, the industry themselves gets to do what works for them. And if it doesn't work for them, then they're not going to have to do it. So this is my frustration, is because we in the United States are made to where if you're fishing, you have to fish this way, you have to mark your gear this way, and you have to fish in this time, and very, very strict regs. But in Canada, it's a little bit less strict because well, they have closures, which is also fantastic. I wish we had closures, but we don't. Cape Cod Bay is the only place, it's the best place for a right whale to be in the entire planet between January or February and April, because nobody can fish there. It's the best regulated place for a right whale, but it's pretty much the only closure in the North American lobster fishery. So Canada has tons of closures. They have like very seasonal lobster fishing around all their maritime islands in the Maritimes, and that also is to their benefit. They don't have quite the issues we do. Because of the right whale deaths that were attributed to Canadian lobster gear, there's been a lot more scrutiny about that. But again, it's not mandated. They have requested that fishermen report when they lose gear, and that is just starting, and it's not really well received yet. They are experimenting with different types of rope. They are also testing the on-demand gear that I talked about, but there are no real strict regs in place for Canada right now. And they definitely have right whales, and they definitely have fixed gear fishing, because they fish a lot of crabs there too, lobsters and crabs. So, yeah, go ahead.
The primary question in my mind is, why can't plastic be recycled? What is the problem that we can't solve that problem?
Sure. The question is, why can't plastic be recycled? What is the problem there? Well, plastics there are many, many plastics. I think there's like 1,400 different types of plastic in the planet. There are hundreds of different kinds of plastic. The ones we're most familiar with as consumers is 1 through 6, right? So you got your polyethylene, your high density and low density. You got your polyester. You got your polyvinyl chloride and your polyethylene terephthalate and all these other things that are 1 through 6, polystyrene. Interestingly, almost all of them could be recycled, technically speaking, in some fashion. Infrastructure doesn't exist for more than, right now, 6% of it to be recycled. Behavior doesn't allow it, because consumers are responsible for themselves versus the industry taking the responsibility. And it is a lot cheaper to just mine new plastic. It's a lot cheaper. So there's no incentive on the part of industry to push the recycling, and there's no incentive on the part of the consumers to change their behaviors, because it's so accessible and so cheap. If we want to start talking about plastics recycling, the best thing you can do is not buy anything made of plastic, but even that doesn't really make a big difference anymore, because we're just one person. I have started saying divest from petrochemical companies, but people make a lot of money investing in oil. And I don't even know that would make a difference. I think behavior change is a really tough thing, and it's so systemic around the planet that it's not gonna happen as an individual. Technically speaking, though, recycling, even if you were to be able to recycle every bit of plastic that we had, 100%, let's say we recycled 50% of the single-use plastic water bottles out there. To what end? To make more plastic? So it doesn't really compute. There's not really an equation there that works. The industry, which is super, super lucrative for everyone involved, as Dustin Hoffman learned in The Graduate, is basically not worth changing, because too many people are too wealthy. The plastics industry is subsidized by the United States government. They get tax breaks. That is why there is a massive push right now at the federal level to create new infrastructure for recycling. So we are gonna see a lot more in the next 10 years of a push from the plastics industry to recycle that plastic bottle, that Coca-Cola that you just bought. But they don't want you to stop drinking Coca-Cola. Are you gonna add to this, Megan?
I was just gonna say this would be a good time to put a plug in for actionable postcards to reduce plastic use. So on the,
Come,
okay, wait.
Megan has something to say in the microphone.
I'm not stopping the question. I'm not stopping the questions, but I'm just going to add because it seems relevant. So on the back table, there are postcards, and they are already stamped and addressed to legislators. And you're going to see 3 bills out. So one, Skip the Stuff. There's one for the Better Bottle bill. The legislation is out on the table, and you can read about it if you'd like. And you have the opportunity to write to 9 postcards to 3 separate legislators for 3 bills that can help reduce plastics. I feel like I need that after a conversation like tonight. So I hope you can take part in that.
Thank you, Megan.
And they already have stamps. You just have to put your return address and put it in the box. I'll mail them.
Amazing. If there's no more, are there any more questions? It's hard to follow that up, and and all of her postcards were donated by Megan. All of this artwork and all of your hard work to make this all happen is really appreciated. Yes, sir.
More a comment than a question. It seems like, our appetite is the root of the problem. Our appetite for lobster. And everything else is just, if we didn't eat lobster, we wouldn't be
Actually,
to change the rope and change the traps and go through all the other stuff. Kabuki dance.
The comment is that really what's driving the problem of lobsters and whales is our appetite for lobsters. What's interesting is that most of the lobster that's caught here goes to China. Did you know that? They catch about 170 million pounds of lobster, or 180, or just depends on the year. And most of it goes overseas. We get like 5% of it. So it's not the US appetite, it's the money that's made to ship lobster. And it is worth a lot of money in those countries, which is why Australia and New Zealand have hugely successful lobster fishery, because there aren't very many fishermen there, because it's a highly competitive fishery, and they make a lot of money for selling their lobsters to Japan and China. And so that is, you're absolutely right, it's human desires that are driving the issue, because if nobody ate seafood, there wouldn't be an issue. But seafood is a massively important protein and around the world, not just a luxury food the way lobsters may be in most places. But you really do have to start looking at that global economy contributing to a very local problem that we are trying to solve locally that's really not solvable locally. And that's why I'm kind of hoping that there's enough understanding about the intricacies of this issue, super, super complicated when you start talking about people's livelihoods, that possibly we can value that work more. We can value the lobster more here. We can pay more for it here. We can pay fishermen more for it, because we feel it's important to get whales without scars on them and fishing gear out of the ocean. So I feel like there's a lot of things we could, plastic out of the ocean. I feel like there are a lot of things we can do to sort of set that pace, but it is pulling teeth, and I swear it's data that is going to make the change. And so we do need more information and more data about those impacts and about the real scale of that issue. And I think more people like yourselves coming out here and listening to me prattle on here, there's a lot of more people raising that awareness. You have Blue Ocean Society in Portsmouth that's doing cleanups all the time. They're always looking for new groups. You have Urban Harbors Institute in Boston. You have Seaside Sustainability. They do a lot in Gloucester. There's a number of places around here that are really trying to drill down into, what we can do as, consumers, because we're all consumers. But I appreciate that comment, because it's not just our neck of the woods. It's really a global problem. So thank you again, and I'm going to hang out for a little bit if you want to wrap it up here and stretch your legs and say hi to your friends. So thanks for coming, and thank you, Storm Surge. Thank you. I forgot to tell you all, my husband's nickname is Stormy. Did you know that too? I mean, it's so great that this is Storm Surge. Stormy.